A humble young woman gave shelter to a man and his son, not knowing that he was a millionaire and that her single act of kindness would alter the course of her life forever. It was a bitter December evening when Eleanor brushed snow from her stoop and caught sight of them. A tall man, his coat frayed and his hair damp with sleet, holding the hand of a boy no older than 8. They looked exhausted, out of place amid the bright holiday lights of Ashbury Lane. Eleanor's heart clenched. She had known hardship herself. She had tasted the cold and the gnawing emptiness of hunger, and she could never turn away someone in need. "Please come in," she urged before they could protest. Her voice was gentle but firm, the way a mother might speak to a frightened child. The man hesitated, his gaze flickering from her earnest face to the modest doorway behind her. Then he nodded, almost imperceptibly, and guided his son into the small, warm cottage. Inside, the scent of cinnamon tea mingled with the faint fragrance of pine from the little tree Eleanor had decorated with second-hand baubles. She helped them out of their damp coats and set them by the fire, noticing the boy's pinched cheeks and the shadows beneath the man's tired eyes. She asked no questions at first. Some stories, she knew, took time to be told. Hours later, after the child had eaten and fallen asleep on her worn sofa, the man finally looked up. His features were striking in the flickering firelight. High cheekbones, a straight nose, eyes as dark as midnight. He seemed accustomed to commanding a room, yet in that moment, he looked disarmed by her kindness. "My name is Adrian," he said quietly, his voice rough with fatigue. "And this is Samuel." Eleanor smiled, offering him another cup of tea. "I'm Eleanor. You're safe here." He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know how to thank you." "There's no need," she replied. "Sometimes we all need help." If she had known that Adrian Caldwell was heir to one of the most formidable fortunes in the country, she might have wondered why he was standing in her living room with nothing but a threadbare satchel. But Eleanor was not the sort to weigh a person's worth by the weight of their wallet. She only saw a father and son who had nowhere else to go. Days passed. Snow blanketed the town in silent drifts, and the world outside seemed to hold its breath. Inside the cottage, Eleanor noticed how Adrian read to Samuel each evening, his voice soft and steady, the child's head resting against his shoulder. She observed how carefully he mended the boy's mittens with clumsy stitches, and how fiercely he watched over him as if afraid he might disappear. Still, he offered little about himself. He said only that they had been traveling, that circumstances had changed, that he needed time to arrange the next step. One afternoon, as pale winter sunlight poured across the kitchen table, Eleanor found Adrian studying her bookshelf. He traced the spines of the novels she'd collected over the years, Dickens, Austen, Woolf, as if they were familiar friends. "You love words," he murmured. "I suppose I do," she said, feeling her cheeks warm. "Books were my escape growing up. They still are." He turned to look at her then, something unspoken in his expression. "You've built a beautiful life here," he said softly, "even with so little." Eleanor looked around at her tidy cottage, the cracked tiles and the patched curtains. "It's enough," she replied. "More than I ever expected." There was a sadness in his eyes she couldn't quite name, as if he were carrying a burden too heavy to set down. That evening, when she returned from her part-time shift at the bakery, she found Samuel sitting at the kitchen table with a pencil and paper. "Miss Eleanor," he said shyly, "Papa says you are very kind. He says you saved us." "I only did what anyone should," she replied, tousling his hair. But later, as she prepared supper, she wondered if that was true, because she had seen how the townspeople looked at Adrian with curiosity and suspicion. She had heard the whispers, strangers in the village always drew gossip. Yet she couldn't bring herself to question why a man who seemed so educated, so composed, had fallen into such dire straits. When at last Adrian spoke of it, the fire had burned low, and the wind howled against the eaves. "My father died last year," he began, his voice as brittle as the frost on the window panes. "And with him went every certainty I'd ever known. The company, our family's legacy, became a battlefield. My brother believes he should be sole heir. When I refused to sign away my stake, he threatened everything. My assets, my reputation, my custody of Samuel." Eleanor listened, her heart thudding. "I had to disappear for a while," Adrian went on, his gaze fixed on the dying embers. "To protect my son, to protect myself." And in that moment she understood the exhaustion in his face, the wary silence, the urgency in his every action. He had not merely lost wealth, he had lost trust in the world. "You're safe here," she said again, her voice low and fierce. "I won't let anyone hurt you." He looked up then, and in the flickering light, she glimpsed gratitude, and something deeper, something she dared not name. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The wind rattled the shutters as if trying to pry its way in, but inside the little cottage, there was a hush so profound it felt almost sacred. Samuel slept bundled beneath a knitted quilt Eleanor's grandmother had made decades before, his small face turned toward the warmth of the stove. Adrian watched him with a tenderness that broke her heart. "You must think me a coward," he said finally, his voice raw. "No," Eleanor replied, shaking her head. "I think you're a father, and you're doing what you must to protect your child." He exhaled, and the shadows beneath his eyes seemed to deepen. When you've spent your life in boardrooms and penthouses, you begin to believe you can control everything, that there is no problem you can't outmaneuver. And then something like this happens, someone you trust turns on you, and you realize you're no different from anyone else. Vulnerable. Alone. Her throat tightened. She knew that feeling all too well. She reached across the table, her hand hesitating before it rested lightly over his. His skin was cold, and she wanted to warm it, to warm all the places in him that had been frozen by fear. "You're not alone," she whispered. His eyes lifted to hers, and she felt that moment settle around them like a promise. The following morning dawned soft and gray, the clouds hanging low over the village rooftops. Eleanor woke early to stoke the fire and start the kettle, determined to preserve a semblance of normalcy. When Adrian entered the kitchen, he looked almost surprised to find her humming to herself as she prepared breakfast. "You act as if none of this is unusual," he remarked, his brow furrowing in wonder. She smiled over her shoulder. "Life rarely gives us the courtesy of being simple. All we can do is meet it as best we can." Samuel came in, rubbing his eyes. Eleanor handed him a mug of warm milk, and he clambered onto a chair, his small hand reaching instinctively for Adrian's. "Can we stay here today?" Samuel asked softly. "It feels safe." Adrian glanced at Eleanor as if seeking permission. "Of course," she said without hesitation. The hours passed with an odd sense of peace. Eleanor taught Samuel to string popcorn garlands for the tree, while Adrian fixed the loose hinge on the pantry door and carried in fresh logs from the woodpile. Each small task felt like a stitch, binding them together into something like a family, though none of them spoke it aloud. In the afternoon, Eleanor slipped into her coat and stepped out to the shop for a few necessities. As she made her way down the lane, the village murmured around her, people bustling with parcels and greetings, children pelting each other with snow. But she couldn't ignore the sidelong glances, the speculative whispers that followed her. Had she truly believed no one would notice? That a man like Adrian, imposing, dignified, undeniably out of place, could stay hidden forever? When she returned, she paused on the threshold, watching the scene in her kitchen. Samuel kneeling before the hearth, carefully feeding the flames, and Adrian crouched beside him, his hand resting on his son's narrow shoulder. The sight struck her with a pang of protectiveness, so fierce it startled her. He looked up as she entered. "Is everything all right?" Eleanor set her parcels on the table. "People are starting to talk." His jaw tightened, though he said nothing. She moved closer, lowering her voice. "I don't care what they think. But if your brother is searching for you—" "He is," Adrian admitted quietly. "He has resources, investigators, connections in every city. But here, he won't expect me to hide. And if he does?" Adrian's eyes met hers, solemn and resolute. "Then I'll be ready." She wished she could believe that was enough. But she had learned, in her own life, that sometimes being ready was not the same as being safe. Still, she said nothing more. Some truths were too heavy to share all at once. That night, after Samuel had gone to bed, Adrian lingered by the fire, watching the embers pulse with a meditative calm. Eleanor sat across from him, her hands wrapped around her tea. The air felt charged, as if everything unsaid between them had been strung taut on invisible wires. "I haven't thanked you properly," he said after a long silence. "You don't have to." "Yes," he interrupted gently. "I do." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You took us in when you had every reason to turn us away. You've shown me what grace looks like, what decency feels like." I had forgotten. Her throat ached, and she didn't trust her voice. So she only nodded, her gaze locked with his. His expression softened. "I won't forget this, Eleanor. Or you." Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters. But inside, the quiet was warm, filled with something tender and precarious. Something that neither of them dared to name, though they both felt it in the marrow of their bones. It happened on a Thursday, one of those still winter mornings when the world feels suspended, like a held breath. Eleanor had just set out 2 mugs of tea when there was a knock at the door. Not the gentle tap of a neighbor, nor the hesitant rap of someone in need. This was precise, sharp, intentional. Adrian stiffened. He rose slowly, motioning for Samuel to stay back, and Eleanor crossed the room before him. Her hand trembled slightly as she opened the door. 2 men in sleek overcoats stood there, their expressions professional and unreadable. Behind them, a black luxury car idled, steam curling from its tailpipe like breath in the frigid air. "Mr. Caldwell," the taller one said with a clipped British accent, "your brother has withdrawn the injunction. The board has voted. The majority is with you." Adrian blinked. "What?" "The lawyers have been notified. You're free to return. The estate is yours. And so is the company." It took him a full beat to register the words, and even then, he didn't react with joy. He only looked at Eleanor. She stood frozen, her eyes wide, lips parted in stunned silence. Slowly, she looked down at Samuel, who clung to the hem of her cardigan like a sapling to solid earth. "I don't understand," she whispered. The men gave a brief nod and returned to their vehicle, the snow crunching crisply beneath their polished shoes. Adrian stood motionless in the entryway, watching the car vanish down the lane. Then he turned back to Eleanor, and something in him shifted. The years of practiced calm, the carefully drawn lines of power and poise, they all crumbled in the presence of this moment. "I never wanted it like this," he said softly. "Not if it means leaving this behind." She opened her mouth to reply, but he stepped forward, his voice thick with everything he hadn't said. "This place, you reminded me what life was supposed to feel like. Not measured in profit margins or private jets, but in mornings spent baking bread, in little hands wrapped around your thumb, in laughter echoing in small rooms. You brought me back to myself, Eleanor." She couldn't look away from him. His eyes were glassy, shimmering with something raw, unguarded. "I know you gave us shelter expecting nothing," he continued. "But I can't pretend that you didn't give me more than that. You gave me peace. You gave my son safety. You gave me love, even if you didn't say the word." Her heart thudded so loudly it seemed to echo in her ears. "Come with us," he said, taking her hands. "Not because of the estate, not because of the fortune, but because we're better with you. Because this, what we found here, it isn't just survival. It's family." Eleanor stared at him, her chest tight with a swirl of hope and fear. She had dreamed of something like this in quiet, fragile corners of her mind. But reality had never given her the luxury of such dreams coming true. Still, Samuel ran to her just then, wrapping his arms around her legs with a kind of certainty only children possess. "Please don't stay behind," he whispered. "We need you." Eleanor sank to her knees, cradling him against her. She looked up at Adrian, saw the vulnerability in his face, the openness of a man no longer wearing a mask. And for once, she didn't question what she deserved. She only answered the calling of her heart. 3 weeks later, the city of Harrowstone welcomed the unexpected return of its prodigal heir, not alone, but with a young woman by his side and a boy who called her Mama without hesitation. Gossip swirled, tabloids speculated, but within the walls of the grand estate, none of it mattered. Adrian restructured the company, choosing purpose over profit. He established shelters across the country, funding programs for single parents and displaced families. The first one bore Eleanor's name. In the heart of the mansion, they kept the tree Samuel had decorated with Eleanor that winter. Popcorn garlands, clumsy paper stars, and all. It remained in a quiet sitting room, untouched by designers or decorators, a monument to where everything had truly begun. Every year, they returned to the cottage for the holidays. It remained just as it was, humble, warm, filled with the scent of cinnamon and firewood. And when they walked through the door, time folded, memory and love rising around them like breath on cold air. Eleanor often sat at the old wooden table, now polished by time, her fingers laced with Adrian's as Samuel played by the hearth. And in those quiet moments, she understood the fullness of her journey. Not just from poverty to prosperity, but from solitude to something greater. She had once believed kindness was its own reward, and perhaps it was. But sometimes, kindness blooms into miracles, into second chances, into a life so unexpected, so rich with purpose and love, that not even the sharpest dream could have shaped it. Not all stories begin with glory. Some begin with snow, a stranger at your door, and a heart brave enough to open. And when they do, the ending writes itself, not in gold or grandeur, but in the quiet, breathtaking wonder of love returned.